Philosophy and Theory tutorial. My name is Ian. Welcome to everybody watching on Instagram, and also welcome to watching on YouTube. We are currently live in Seattle. It is characteristically rainy outside. I am sitting in my car. Perhaps you will hear the pitter-patter of droplets on the windscreen, on the front screen. If you're joining for the very first time today, this is a weekly introduction to philosophy and theory tutorial that I have been hosting for the past 2 years. We are currently in the midst of a lecture series on the topic and theme of love, the philosophy of love, the psychoanalysis of love, why Zizek argues that Hegel is the predominant philosopher of love. And today, we're going to be dedicating an entire hour, 60 minutes, to a discussion on the Lacanian definition of love, namely that love is loving the lack in the other. And if you're joining us for the very, very first time today, welcome to our global learning community. We are a collective of, like-minded enthusiasts who enjoy learning about philosophy and continental theory, psychoanalysis, etc. If you're joining us from a country that is not the United States, although perhaps you are somewhere in the United States that is not Seattle, please do leave a comment. It makes me super, super happy when you guys leave a comment telling me where you're joining us from. It is, I've said this before, it is genuinely the part of this project that gives me joy, is knowing that there are people around the world who feel connected and that make me feel connected to you. I see someone from Turkey. I see you. I see Stuttgart. Hallo, guten Morgen. Malaysia, that's amazing. India, that is so beautiful. Another person from Germany. Hello, back to Germany. United Kingdom, UK, you have a new prime minister, as I've seen this morning. Egypt, Olivia, all right. Oxford, I actually used to work in Oxford a couple years ago before I came to the US. That's where I worked as an academic. Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, India, guten Abend, yes, it is German evening. Copenhagen, okay, that's amazing. Thank you guys so much. That makes me very, very happy. London, I used to live in London. Virginia, Indonesia. That's absolutely beautiful. Thank you guys so much. I love it when you guys keep those comments coming. It makes me really, really, really happy. I see someone from the Netherlands and Mexico, Russia. It's beautiful. Like, I really, perhaps I'm naive, perhaps I'm an idealist, but the fact that like we can literally bring together people from around the world in a live stream is unreal. It's amazing. And that's super cool. So thank you. That's amazing. Okay, so today, this is going to be part one of a two-part lecture. So this Monday and next Monday, in which I want to tackle the Lacanian psychoanalytic theory of love, which is the idea of loving the lack in the other. And then next week, we're going to relate that back to Zizek's interpretation of Hegel as the philosopher of love. And so within the span of this week and next week, hopefully you'll have all the pieces to stitch together why love as a concept is so integral to what Zizek calls essentially his ontological project, namely his take on Hegel, on Hegelian speculative idealism seen through the lens of Lacanian psychoanalysis. And so today, we're going to talk about the Lacanian theory of love. So if you want to stick around, please do get comfortable. We're going to be here for a little while. Very quick plug. So all of these lectures are 100% free. Open access on the internet, because I believe in open access education. Super important to me. I think that's how knowledge should be shared and spread. I don't think that we should put up paywalls and barriers to learning. That being said, the way that I finance this project is through Patreon. And so if you'd like to support these lectures, these tutorials, if you'd like to support my continued existence here in the digital sphere, please do consider becoming a patron. As a patron, you can download the audio for every single one of my tutorials. That's multiple years of tutorials. So like, I don't know, close to 100 tutorials at this point. You can download all of those as a podcast, as a patron. You can also download my ebook introduction to Zizek and Lacan, because after every lecture series, every 3 months, I release an ebook version of those lectures. And right now, you can download the ebook from the previous lecture series, which was called The Useless Precaution, which is an introduction to Zizek and Lacan as well. And so if you'd like to support this project, I'd hugely appreciate it if you went to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. That's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. If you're on YouTube, you can find the link on YouTube. And if you're on Instagram, the link is available in this video once I post it. So if you've enjoyed the series, if you enjoyed this video, I'd super appreciate it. A huge thank you to our patrons from around the world who basically allow this project to continue to exist, which is phenomenal. And I feel like I'm making my dream come true. So thank you to all of our patrons around the world. Okay, let us begin, because today we have a juicy one. And I want to start with something very relatable, because before we dive into the thickets of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is not very accessible, I want to start with something very universal, hopefully. Namely, the Batman and the Joker. And I've actually seen this a couple times now, where in multiple spin-off series based on Batman, like whether it's the Harley Quinn show on HBO, whether it's the Lego Batman, the idea is that the relationship that Batman and Joker have is suspiciously close to being a relationship of codependency. And of course, that was always sort of implicit, right, within Batman's reliance on the continued existence of the Joker for his own ontological security, which is an expensive way of saying that Batman needs the Joker in order to have a reason to exist. And vice versa, the Joker, of course, needs Batman as the ultimate villain, as the ultimate foe, as the ultimate antagonist to be Joker as such. In this sense, the relationship that Batman and Joker have is always suspiciously close to being a relationship of love, if you will. And since love is our topic today, I thought that is where we would start. There's a great scene, which is essentially the climax of the Lego Batman movie, which is that Joker finally has to admit his love for Batman in that precise sense. And this relationship of codependency, this relationship between love and hate, between having someone who is both your rival and, in a sense, your friend almost, a friend in mutual rivalry. This is actually how Lacan relates to the idea of hate. Because the Lacanian definition of hate is simply inflicted love. And one of the things that Lacan's trying to point out here is that the manner in which you engage with hate isn't entirely different from the manner in which you engage in love. Of course, when you hear that, you think, wow, they're totally different. When you hate somebody, you're being mean and awful to them. When you love someone, you're being tender and caring for them. And yet what Lacan's fundamentally doing is that he's adapting two of the Freudian aspects of Freud's theory of love, and he's kind of twisting them on his head. This is what Lacan always does. He takes Freudian ideas and he doesn't refute them. He simply kind of like turns them into their opposite form. Now, two of the fundamental components of a love attachment for Freud, within Freudian psychoanalysis, are one, narcissism, and two, dependency. What Freud essentially is arguing is that your relationship to the other when you're in love is very much about your relationship to yourself. That, in a sense, you can't have a relationship with someone else if there isn't, at some level, a narcissistic attachment to your own being. Secondly, that there is an aspect of codependency, which I know in today's world of online psychiatry, etc., is like a red flag. And yet what Freud was simply trying to point out is that within every relationship, you lean upon the other. That a relationship in which you don't lean upon the other means that there's no vulnerability in the relationship. And so for Freud, part of having a healthy relationship is understanding that there's always a mutual aspect of dependency in a relationship and an aspect of narcissism. And this is where Lacan messes with Freud, essentially, because Lacan simply says, well, the same is true for hate, which is that when you hate somebody, it's a narcissistic attachment to that person, right? Because when you hate somebody, it's like a righteous fury that you have about why you hate that person. In fact, the manner in which we hate becomes very closely tied to our own identity. Think about the things that you hate are often the things that you identify as being against. Like, oh, I hate this type of person, or I hate this type of... It can be even an object. I hate this type of car, or I hate people who play PlayStation versus Xbox, etc. The manner in which you hate becomes very closely tied to your identity. And so there's a narcissistic element attached to the idea of hatred, which can be very difficult to let go of. Secondly, there's an element of dependency within hate. The more you hate, the more you come to be reliant on hating that person or hating that thing, because increasingly without it, you wouldn't exist. This is one of the problems when it comes to like intergenerational conflicts, where people don't even remember what the conflict was originally about. They're just so preoccupied with hating the other and the grievances that have stacked up over time that now their own very identity and their sense of history is predicated on a sense of grievance. And so hate becomes a dependency, which is a narcissistic dependency, which is that what makes it so hard to forgive somebody is that when you forgive somebody, you're also forgiving... I don't know how I put this properly. When you forgive somebody, you risk losing a part of your own identity. If for so long the person who you are has become a person who has hatred in their heart, that you identify as hating this person or this thing, then it means that when you forgive somebody, there's a part of you that disappears as well, the part of you that is predicated on this identity. And this is why Lacan essentially, and he's joking, but he's also being quite serious, says that hate is an expression of love or transference of love, which is to say that you love yourself when you hate somebody else, right? It's a righteous position. There's narcissism implicit in this. And secondly, when you hate somebody else, you also, in a sense, fall in love. You become dependent. You need to continue hating them. So one of the hardest things about hate is that when you hate somebody, it's usually not, well, I'm going to hate you for a while and then I'm done. Like I've spent all my hate. Now we're good. Instead, hate has to grow. It has to sustain itself. It becomes parasitic. And so you become the person who has to fuel that hate because you want to prove to yourself that this hatred has legitimacy. And so the manner in which we engage with hating somebody for Lacan is very close to the manner in which we engage with loving somebody, which is that before you know it, there's an element of codependency and there's an element of narcissism. It's constitutive to your own identity, even though it's very much about the other person. This is also why forgiveness is, of course, so important. Forgiveness is one of the primary expressions of love, because forgiveness is to say, I will no longer allow my hatred to determine who I am. And there's an element of risk involved in this, right? Because when you forgive somebody, you're saying it's not just that I forgive you, it's that I now need to grow. I need to fill out this empty space that has grown within me that I have filled up with hate. And so this is something that Lacan talks about quite a bit, that the relationship that we have to the other, with love, with hate, etc., often says more about us than it says about them. Which is a simplification, of course, right? But I want to start with a simplification, and then we can make it a little bit more difficult. So what we're going to do in this class is I'm going to try to explain and introduce the Lacanian psychoanalytic definition of love, his famous formula of love, which is that you love the lack in the other. And then next week, we're going to link that to Zizek's take on Hegelian speculative idealism, because if there's one thing that you need to know about Slavoj Zizek's philosophy, is that he essentially takes Lacanian psychoanalysis and uses it as a kind of lens through which to view Hegelian idealism very differently. And that's what I'm going to hope to explain to you within the next 2 weeks. Okay, so Lacan essentially has this idea, which is that love is love of the lack in the other. And he actually complicates this a little bit by saying that love is giving what you don't have to someone who doesn't want it, which is all quite confusing. And yet I think that we can break it down into some bite-sized chunks that hopefully everybody can understand. Now, when Lacan says love is when you love someone, you love the lack in the other. It's simply code. I want to be very clear here, and then we can explain how he gets there. It's simply code for what you desire is to be desired by the other. This is the basic formula that Lacan has for love, which is I want you, and I want you to want me. In other words, what you want is a requital of your love. And yes, it is raining currently, so hopefully that's not too disruptive, but you can probably hear the rain fall outside. It's actually raining quite a bit. We are in Seattle after all, right? Rainy city. Okay, so when Lacan says that you love the lack in the other, he's essentially saying that you desire to be desired. And what's important here is that when Lacan uses the idea of lack, he usually relates it to desire. And so one of the things that I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is I'm going to try to break down what Lacan means by lack and what Lacan means by desire. Side note, I'm very glad that you are enjoying the sound of the rain. It's very soothing, and I'm glad that it translates to this live stream. Yeah, it's like one of those like lo-fi chill hop videos, except we're talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis. Okay, so Lacan has an interesting theory of lack. Let's define lack first of all, because when Lacan uses this word quite a lot, when Lacan says that love is loving the lack in the other, this doesn't really make sense unless you know what a lack is. And to understand what lack is, you have to go all the way back to the Freudian castration complex, which once again, Lacan takes and he sort of radicalizes. The best way to understand the Freudian castration complex, in my own mind, is to contrast it to the idea of the phantom limb syndrome. Now, the phantom limb syndrome, as you probably know already, is when you've lost a limb and yet it feels like it's still there. You can still feel it aching, which must be a terrible thing to experience. Contrasted to this, the castration complex isn't, I've lost something and it feels like it's still there. Instead, the castration complex is almost the exact opposite, which is the thing is still there, and yet it feels to be lost. It feels like it's gone. It's been rendered symbolically impotent, like a dead limb. If you will, like, without meaning to be too provocative, this is sort of the problem at the heart of like incel culture, which is to say, involuntarily celibate. The idea is I have the member, the male sex organ, and yet I cannot use it. And what's really important about the idea of the castration complex for Freud and for Lacan is that the castration complex presents a fundamental problem of all power, which can be summed up as followed. Power isn't the absence of weakness. Power is simply a response to weakness or negated weakness. Think about it. Most people who are strong were simply people who were hurt and vowed to never be weak again. Absolute power, as we all know, corrupts absolutely, but that's because absolute power renders power impotent. Now, what does that mean? Why would absolute power render power impotent? Think about it. If power is what you use in the world to overcome obstacles, in other words, to overcome the things that make you weak, this means that power is simply refracted weakness. And if power were to be made absolute, then there would be no obstacle. There would be nothing that would thwart you. In other words, in a world in which power becomes absolute, impotence no longer exists. The lack of power doesn't exist. Power in the world as a finite entity, as something which you can use or exert, is strictly codependent on absence of power. There are limits to your power, which is exactly how you make power manifest. And the idea of being all-powerful is thereby, within Hegelian speculative idealism, which we will then relate to Lacanian psychoanalysis, the idea of power being absolute is the zero-sum point at which power no longer exists. It's a little bit like when you say that, like, you love everything. Well, if you love everything, then you don't really love anything, right? Because there's no distinction that can be made anymore. And so the idea of power as absolute is that power disappears. It like just vanishes. Instead, power is always a measure of your relative impotence. The idea of power is directly related to the extent to which you are or feel weak. And this is something that goes all the way back, for example, to Augustine. Augustine has like a fairly interesting, kind of funny theory about the male sex organ, about the penis. And Augustine essentially says that the penis is the thing that a man can't control. That the penis is a sign of the fact that man cannot control himself. Every adolescent male will know this, that the problem of the penis, at least in adolescence, and perhaps even beyond that, is that it doesn't work when you want it to, and it works when you don't want it to. In other words, unwanted erections versus the impossibility of achieving erection. And Augustine says that this thing, this male sex organ, the penis, thereby keeps man humble, reminds man that there is something that he does not have control over within himself. And Augustine is frustrated by this, of course, because essentially what he's saying is that it can be triggered. It's something that is outside of the domain of your will. And if you think about it, for example, the same could be said when it comes to like food porn. If you watch an advertisement for a hamburger, your stomach will literally start creating stomach acid. Your mouth will start producing saliva. Because you've seen a juicy hamburger on TV, your brain will literally be tricked into creating the preconditions for consuming that item of food. And so what Augustine is essentially arguing is that the male sex organ, and the female sex organ in this way too, in terms of lubrication, that it can be triggered by things that are seemingly entirely outside of your own will or control. That you are not the master of it, it is the master of you. Which is, in an Augustinian way, simply saying that desire is not what you desire, but desire structures you. That you are the vessel of desire, that you are the victim of desire, that desire marks the X point in which you are no longer in control of yourself, in which you are reactive to it. That's essentially what he has in mind here. However, there's a more important element to this, because by itself, that's not a particularly revolutionary idea. It's like, yeah, we all have biological urges, I get it. And yet what Augustine is essentially arguing, which is a lot more complex, is that it is precisely man's inability to control himself that creates the necessity of control. It's the very thing that is a marker of man's impotence, namely the impotence to control my potency, right? My phallus in this sense, is what creates the need to control it. In other words, male power for Augustine is related to the absence of the male power to control himself and to control his urges. And so here we have what is essentially a philosophical problem that Augustine is teeing up for us, which is the manner in which will and in the manner in which power and the assertion of agency emerges precisely against the backdrop of that which we do not have agency over, that which we do not control. And so self-control and self-mastery for Augustine isn't saying I have control over my body. It's precisely an awareness that you do not have control over your body. And this paradox, by which the representation of your virility is in fact the marker of the kind of limitless horizon of your own impotence, this peculiar paradox by which the thing that is supposed to be the sign and the symbol of male strength is in fact the precondition for such strength, because it is the opposite of said strength, because it is the marker of man's weakness. This is precisely what Lacan calls the phallus. Think about it, like, even on a very like obvious level, without having to go into theory, the penis for man is his most vulnerable point, both psychologically and physically. All you have to see is an athlete who's one of the strongest people in the world, who, if they are hit in an unfortunate place, will succumb to being crumpled on the ground. To be crass, the crown jewels are not well protected. And this paradox which is that the thing that is supposed to be at the heart of male strength and virility and masculinity contains also his weakness, his Achilles heel. This is the idea that Augustine tees up, which then Lacan turns into the notion of the phallus. The phallus. I don't know why I cannot say this word. The phallus, which comes from Freud. Now, it's very important to note here that the phallus, the idea of the phallus for Freud and Lacan, is not the physical reality of the male sex organ. Instead, it is the symbolic reality of the sex organ, which is that the sex organ, which is supposed to be the symbol of strength, is also the symbol of insecurity, the symbol of weakness. I think we can all say that there's nothing that will freak out a man more than anything problematic related to his nether regions in that sense. It's a very touchy subject, both literally and metaphorically. And so for Lacan, the idea of the phallus is the symbolic penis. That's all you have to know. That's basically the definition. It's not the biological reality. It's the idea of the symbolic penis. Specifically, the paradox by which the symbolic penis is thereby that what appears to be the marker of strength is in fact also that which contains weakness or emptiness. In other words, for Lacan, the phallus isn't just the symbolic penis. It's specifically the symbolic lack within penis. Now, all of this aside, all this penis stuff aside, we're going to build this up slowly, so don't no pun intended, don't worry. It's going to be hopefully a little bit more clear to you in a moment. Now that we know that phallus is symbolic lack, now we can understand something about the Lacanian idea that what you love is the lack in the other. Because if the phallus is not the physical reality of penis, if the phallus is the reality or the truth of penis, which is its symbolic lack, which creates its potency, or as Augustine said, the thing which controls you makes you have to control yourself, this process is for Lacan precisely the process of desire. Because we've already covered this, the Lacanian formula for desire isn't that you desire something concrete. You don't desire something that is a physical object. What you desire is desire itself. Lacan's famous formula of desire is simply that what you desire isn't the object. What you desire is the object cause of desire. It's also why Slavoj Žižek always argues that one of the fundamental lessons of psychoanalysis is that we don't know what we want. That we confuse the thing that we think we want with the underlying reason why we continue to want things. Everybody's experiences, right, on a common sense level, which is you've worked your way up to a certain goal, and then you achieve that goal, and then it's very empty. It's like a Pyrrhic victory. You don't want it anymore. Athletes talk about this, where they've dedicated years of their life to training, and then they win, like, I don't know, a Grand Slam or a Super Bowl or something, a championship. And the moment that they've won the championship, it's anticlimactic afterwards. What do I do with myself? And usually the answer is, well, you win another one. And then you win another one and another one. That what an athlete realizes is that what they're chasing isn't the trophy. What they're chasing is the chase itself. It overdetermines their very existence. Now, for an athlete, this may be sort of on an epic proportion, and yet it's also true in day-to-day life, that in many ways, in life, we're constantly chasing the next thing because we love the chase. We don't enjoy having the thing. It's like you buy a pair of shoes. It's fun for a while, and then you want another pair of shoes. Or, in a sense, this is like coded within us. You get to breakfast. A couple hours later, you want lunch. Then you want a snack. Then you want dinner. Life is simply a recurrence of desires, both biological needs and necessities, and overarching psychological desires that go above and beyond our needs. I don't know, a faster car, newer clothing, the latest movie, the latest video game. There are many ways in which we chase the next thing. And Lacan doesn't condemn this. Lacan's not a Buddhist. He's not saying that we should detach ourselves from our earthly material desires. Instead, Lacan says that this is the underlying cause of why we keep desiring. It's not to be satisfied, it's to remain fruitfully unsatisfied. That as long as we keep on desiring, as long as we remain sufficiently detached from achieving our goals, we continue to feel alive. We continue to prosper. Desire is simply refracted lack. Here's the thing that I am lacking. Here's the thing that I need in order to be complete or in order to fill myself. And so the more you can stretch out this lack, the more enjoyment you can receive from it. The more difficult a video game is, the more satisfactory it is when you beat the final boss. And the same thing applies for life. The larger your goals are, the bigger your dreams are, nobody enjoys, I'm going to be the person who's the best at taking out the trash. That's not satisfying. We enjoy big dreams. Dreams in which we can be the protagonist of our own epic. And so the idea of lack, namely the idea of impotency, the idea of symbolic absence, is constitutive to the manner in which we fill in life itself. You're always chasing your own tail. You're chasing your own lack, which someone says in the comments, it can be exhausting. It can be deeply tiring. I think that fundamentally we all desire that we could push a pause button on existence. But the problem that Lacan states, which he actually takes from Hegel, is the problem with the ascetic, which is that even if you decide to stop desiring, you are now simply desiring to not desire. It's the short circuit of desire. You can't transcend the horizon of desire. And so the person who becomes an ascetic or a hermit, for wanting a car, now I want, I don't know, inner peace or calm or no longer to desire. The fact that even when we are undesirous, that we are desiring to be not desirous, is the problem at the heart of subjectivity for Lacan. The way in which he formulates it is quite beautiful. He says that, yes, for Lacan, the idea of being the person who desires to be outside the realm of desire. Ideology is what gives structure and meaning to the manner in which we keep on desiring. After all, if you think about it, how do we come to desire the things that we desire? Some of them are biologically determined, but these are needs, not desires. Desires are psychosocial. Desires are things that are generated through the dreams of others, whether it's cinema or advertisements or simply what your neighbor has on their lawn. Desire is refracted through the desire of the other, through symbolic, to the chaos of the manner in which we desire. It's like a consumer report guide that tells you exactly which card is thereby a formula of lack, which is that if desire is not desire for an object, and when lack is the truth of desire, what that simply means is that you love the desire in the other, which is another way of saying that when Lacan says that love is the love of the lack of the other, to be that which they want, because you want them. It's really quite simple if you put it that way, right? That to love the lack in the other means I love their desire. And to love their desire is to say, I want to be the person you desire. And before we get to love, I just want to have a little side note here, which is that one of the things that I've often said is that a formula is that love is not a competition. Love is repetition. And here we have repetition in this precise sense of the Freudian Lacanian repetition compulsion, Wiederholungszwang, which is that love isn't something that you can complete. There's no final perpetually renew and refresh and reinvent. Love is something that you have to demonstrate over and over again through compassion and kindness, through mutual love and respect and caring and comfort and finding solace in the other person's embrace. This is something that many philosophers constant reformulating. And so in the same manner in which love is the kind of neurotic repetition of that which cannot be ever truly satisfied, In the same manner for Lacan, love is the lack in the love is the love of the lack in the other. What you love is the desire of the other, namely you want them to desire you. And this is why it's important that Lacan doesn't mean desire as in like they lust cause of desire. I mean, the reason why we continue to desire, remain unfulfilled, is true at the heart of love. That love is the love of the lack in the other, again. In this sense, love is repetition and not competition. In this precise sense, which is, I want to, we've determined that that he means that you love the desire in the other, and that lack is related of impotence. Now we can take all of those ideas and start talking about the fetish and perversion. Now, sexual on people has nothing to do with like kink shaming, for example. It's not about the idea of a pervert. But if the phallus, for Lacan, of man's impotence, in other words, the very paradoxical thing that determines man's strength by means of being a symbol of his impotence, or as Freud calls it, the castration complex, namely not the problem that you've lost the limb and it feels like it's still there, but the exact inverse of the problem, namely that you still have the member and yet it feels like it's not there, that it has been rendered symbolically impotent. Once you realize that, as we talked about before, you realize that at the very heart, the very core, the truth, the strength of the phallus is thereby predicated on its emptiness. Or in like more technical terms, that masculinity is ontologically incomplete. There is no basis, no solid foundational core to the idea of masculinity. Of course, there's a lot of biological determinism that men have evolved to be stronger because they protect women, and that women choose the strongest men and then they procreate, etc., etc. But that itself is also a perversion, and we'll get to that in a moment. And so this idea that the phallus is the symbolic marker of the problem of power, which is power emerging in response to perceived or imaginary impotence. This process is never a process of compensation for Freud and Lacan. For example, if you look at like a rocket and you say, wow, Jeff Bezos' rocket looks a lot like a penis, and thereby it's probably because he has a small penis and he's trying to overcome this with the rocket, that would not be in sync with psychoanalysis. The phallus is never a physical compensation for a physical lack. It's never saying your member is small and therefore you need to have a large like a compensation. Like, it's not saying you're going to have a big car because you have a small penis. Instead, the problem is almost the exact opposite, which is you have a big penis, you have penis, and yet you need to prove its bigness. Penis is there as a marker either of your strength or a marker of your impotence. In other words, penis exists as symbolic lack. And here's where it gets a little bit even more quirky, because where does Freud take the idea of the castration complex from? Well, he takes it from the idea that when a man discovers that a woman is lacking in penis, in other words, that a woman doesn't have a penis, that the only way in which man can overcome this traumatic realization, it's like what happens to, Gohan in the first episodes of Dragon Ball, when he like discovers that Bulma doesn't have what he has. This shocking realization, namely the lack in the woman, the lack of penis, the absence of penis, has to be compensated by elevating the woman's lack into a +1, into the sublime. And the only way in which the female lack can be elevated into a positive marker is paradoxically by rendering the male penis into a sign of lack. This is like the kind of crazy reversal that Freud comes up with, which again, we're not trying to clinically prove. This is a conceptual framework I'm introducing so that next week we can relate this to Hegelian idealism and Zizek's theory of and critique of ideology. And so Freud basically has this idea, which is that what Lacan later calls the sublime. For Lacan, the sublime is simply the object elevated to the level of the thing. For example, if you go into church and you see a relic, we have what is essentially just a piece of wood or a piece of metal that we've elevated into an object of worship. In other words, the sublime, an object elevated to the level of the thing. Freud's idea of the sublime is almost the exact opposite of that, which is it's the lack of the object elevated to the level of the thing. And so now the woman's lack of penis is elevated to the sublime, to the level of the thing, namely the idea of womanhood, the idea of sacred femininity, which has to be protected by men, etc. And yet, the reason that it is elevated to the sublime in a circular fashion is because the only way in which it can be elevated to the sublime is to render the male positive feature, the male plus one, the male member, as a sign of lack. It's a simple logical equation, which is that if you want to take what woman is quote unquote lacking and you want to elevate it into the sacred, thereby the thing that the man has now becomes the symbol of the obscene, the symbol of emptiness, of weakness. And so in this weird refractive mirror-like way, the very idea that masculinity is that men have to protect women is predicated on disavowing the traumatic realization that there is nothing in woman, that there is no male organ. This is Lacan's most provocative slogan, often totally misinterpreted, when he says that there is no feminine sexuality. What he means when he says that there is no feminine sexuality is that there is no interrelationship between the sexes as a binary, man and woman. There's nothing natural, biologically determined about this. Instead, when Lacan says that there is no sexual relationship, he says that the very idea of femininity, namely the manner in which the object is elevated to the level of the thing, or the female sublime, or the idea of the beautiful sacred woman who has to be protected at all costs by the strong man, this fantasy is itself predicated on the lack within the man himself, on the symbolic absence, the symbolic phallus, the sign of his own impotency as a marker of his own strength within masculinity. And now you can understand why for Lacan masculinity is the pervert's position. Because the pervert for Lacan, not being about sexual deviation, the pervert is the one who finds something that he elevates to the level of the sublime to disavow the emptiness underneath. Let me give you an example that Zizek uses. Classic psychoanalytic example of fetishistic disavowal. A man whose wife dies. A man whose wife dies adopts a hamster, a pet hamster. And the man falls deeply in love with this hamster. He takes care of the hamster every day, and he never mourns his wife. And yet when the hamster dies, the man has a complete meltdown, a breakdown. In other words, his affection for the hamster, his idealization of the hamster, was a fetishistic disavowal of the pain he felt underneath for the woman. The absence of his wife, the mourning process that he didn't commit to for his wife, was made manifest into the idealization of the hamster. In other words, fetishistic disavowal. Within Lacanian psychoanalysis, this is the position of the pervert. The one who maps, the one who masks the emptiness underneath through the idealization of something else. It's a barrier. The hamster is a barrier so that the man doesn't have to confront the pain he experienced for the loss of his wife. The exact same thing happens within masculinity, which is that now the idealization of womanhood and femininity, namely the process by which we've elevated the object to the level of the thing, the sublime, the process by which we've elevated femininity into the very thing that allows us to never have to confront the ontological emptiness within the idea of the male member itself, namely the phallus, and the fact that we insist that this is a determinate biological reality, this is the position of the pervert, namely the one who has taken the woman and femininity and dressed her up as if she were a hamster to cradle and take care of and idolize so as to never have to confront the darkness underneath, the empty space underneath, which is the confrontation with the fact that lack is constitutive. That at the core of the idea of what it means to be a man is symbolic lack, is phallus. And what we replace that with is precisely the idealization of physical, biological, male member reality, which can only be sustained through the fantasy of ideal femininity, the woman who is weak, who has to be protected by the strong man hunter type. This is the position of the pervert. The pervert is the one who idealizes the object elevated to the level of the thing in order to repress and mask over the emptiness underneath. And this is why Lacan says that love is not just the truth of desire, it's the truth of lack. That once you realize and embrace the idea that lack is constitutive, that's when you can love the lack in the other. Because if you're loving the other person because you think that they have to be protected and you have to guarantee their security and that you are the virile man who will provide for her, etc., you have a fetishistic attachment to the idea of womanhood, but you don't have an attachment to the woman itself, to herself. And so the way in which you overcome your fetishistic attachment to the idea of femininity, which is a narcissistic attachment to paper over the fact that you don't have to uncover the constitutive lack buried within the idea of your own potency, rendered as symbolic impotency, is thereby precisely the elevation of woman into the divine and sacred. And this whole process, of course, how violence against women is justified over and over again. That the problem isn't that women are impure. The problem is that women have to be protected. Other men can't look at women, or we have to protect their virginity or their security, etc. The idealization of womanhood and ideal femininity is the primary gesture of subordinating women. And the liberation of women is precisely predicated on demystifying the idea of ideal womanhood, demystifying the idea of femininity. Hence why Lacan, when he says that there is no feminine sexuality, is actually, in a very provocative way, making a feminist gesture, or proto-feminist gesture, which is to say that femininity is overdetermined by the emptiness within male virility, which is compensated for by the idea of masculinity, namely masculinity as the guarantor of femininity. Thereby, femininity is simply the overdetermination of the lack within the masculine himself. In other words, the masculine man is the pervert, the one who upholds the idea of femininity as the sublime in order to paper over the constitutive necessity of his own inner lack, namely phallus as symbolic lack. And then you understand why love is to love the lack in the other, because it's the opposite of idealizing the other person. It's the opposite of saying you are the ideal femininity that I have to protect. Instead, you love the lack in the other in the manner in which you love the lack in yourself. And finally, we're back at what is almost a platitude of love, namely that you can't love the other person before you love yourself. And then you realize that what Lacan is simply saying is a refracted version of this, which is that you cannot love the lack in the other unless you love the lack in yourself. And this paradoxical inversion by which true love, namely the truth of love, is precisely to say that the truth of love is the constitutive necessity of absence or lack within your own self, which masks as the impotency hidden within your own potency, is refracted through the other in their own desire, and that this mutual intercourse of desire, namely that you want to become the object of their desire as they are the object of yours, this is the truth of love, which is the empty ontological core within the idea of love itself. Hence also why love can't be proven, it can't be made manifest. You can't sign the dot. You can't sign a contract on love. Love is precisely neurotic and compulsive and repetitive and not a competition because it revolves around this constitutive lack. I love the lack in you in the manner in which I love the lack in myself. And this honesty, this defetishization, this demystification of what love is precisely the precondition for the emergence of love as a truth event, as I talked about in the previous class. Love is a truth process. Love being the process of contingent necessity by which what appears as the truth of your own self emerges, refracted to you through the truth in another. All of that's in the previous lecture. And so now we can see why the pervert is incapable of loving. Because the pervert is somebody whose attachment remains fetishistic. Fetishistic specifically because it is a form of fetishistic disavowal. For Lacan, fetishistic disavowal is simply the obfuscation of an originary lack. And the obfuscation of an originary lack can thereby manifest in a substitute idealization, which tries to suggest that what appears to be lacking is in fact complete. That, for example, masculinity is the truth of what it means to be a man. That strength and protecting women is the truth of what it means to be a man. And it's precisely this, which is a fetishistic attachment, because it suggests that masculinity, or to be male, to be man, is not ontologically incomplete. And once you embrace the idea of ontological incompleteness, you can understand the manner in which love is constitutive in the precise way in which lack is constitutive. And if lack is constitutive in the same manner in which desire and love are constitutive, then the only way to properly be in love with someone is not to say, you are the person who I need, you are the lack who I need. In other words, you love the lack in the manner in which you love the lack in yourself. This is also what Lacan calls embracing your own symptom. The definition of successful psychoanalytic treatment is to enjoy your symptom. And enjoying your symptom is to enjoy the other person's symptom. You become each other's symptom. And finally, this is a sense Lacan's theory of the type, that there is no such thing as having a type. That when you create a type, you've created a predetermined list of categories that you want the other person to fit into. And yet love is precisely the process by which retroactively the other person appears not as your type, but as a type unto themselves. And the process by which someone becomes a type unto themselves is thereby the very process by which you come to love the lack in them and they love the lack in you. That's Lacan's theory of love. All right. Thank you guys so much. It's been my pleasure to do this. I know this has been like a lot. This is a difficult, weird, hard to grasp concept within Lacanian psychoanalysis. And so hopefully today I've laid out the foundations. And next week, we can take these concepts and we can relate them to Zizek's take on Hegelian speculative idealism. Because the whole point of this tutorial is to give you the ingredients from Lacan. And then next week, I'll give you the ingredients from Hegel. And then we can mix them up into, like, I don't know, some kind of great philosophical cake. That's going to be the idea. So thank you guys so much for watching today. I want to very quickly say that if you want to support these tutorials, if you would like to download them as a podcast, you can go to www.patreon.com/JenLean and and you can download all the classes. You can download my ebook introduction to Lacan and Zizek. I'm going to type in the link really quick here so that hopefully you can go there. It also gives you access to my weekly podcast that I record together with my co-host, Jenneline, who is also my lovely wife. And this is the link. So if you go here, it starts at just $5 a month, and it really makes a big difference. It's the only way that I can keep doing this. And I know it's very low budget, but it is a passion project. I love doing this, and I hope that you also find value in this. Hello also to everybody on YouTube. I've been posting daily explainer videos to YouTube. It's very fun to do. It's a lot of work, but it's fun. And I'm really glad that you guys are getting so much out of it from what I can tell. So if you'd like a shorter breakdown of this, you can also look on YouTube. Thank you guys again so much. And please, 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 if you want to support this project, go to www.patreon.com/JenLean and Julian. And yes, as Jason Guy Smiley says in the comments, you can go to our Discord and you can literally ask me live questions that I answer during the recording of our podcast, during our weekly Q&A. So that's always super fun for me to actually get to like have a bit of an exchange. All right, guys, thank you so much. It's been my absolute pleasure today. Before I sign off, please do take a look at the Patreon, www.patreon.com/JenLean and Julian. All right, I'm out, and I will see you guys in the Discord in about 5 minutes for the recording of our Q&A. All right, love you all. See you guys next week.